Hey, everybody. If you haven't figured it out, that's me with blue hair. When Roe v. Wade fell, I was asked on Twitter if I would have preferred to have been aborted. I know. People feel comfortable asking adoptees like me intrusive questions like this because we've framed adoption and abortion as an either or moral argument. That's why today I want to talk about why it's so problematic that we're using these moral frameworks to distract voters from the real issues at hand, like using government and money to control women's and children's bodies, and the idea of how deeply ingrained that notion is within the rise of Christian nationalism in America's capitalist system. So buckle up. We're going to talk about some stories in history that I hope will help contextualize the relationship between adoption and abortion and why those topics are so politically and religiously charged. Obviously, I have to start with the OG adoptee, Moses. If you remember, he was put in a basket, sent down the Nile, and raised by the Pharaoh's daughter's family. Why was he put in a basket? Well, there was an infanticide of Hebrew baby boys going on. It was a population culling. Pharaoh was worried that if there were too many Hebrews, they might rise up. Proponents of adoption love to point to the story of Moses because he's an adoptee hero who freed his people from Egyptian rule. But here's a reminder. Moses is a hero because he overthrew the government of his adoptive family. Yikes. Yeah. We also have to revisit King Solomon's judgment from the Old Testament. In it, King Solomon is approached by two women from the same house with one of their two baby boys. The other baby has died, so the women are arguing over who the remaining baby belongs to. Solomon suggests that they just cut the baby in half and give each half to each woman. The first woman is like, that's fine. If I can't have my baby, then nobody can. The second woman begs Solomon, please just give my baby to the other woman. Just don't cut him in half. So Solomon declares the second woman the true mother, reasoning that only a true mother would give her baby up just to save his life. Sound familiar? Solomon's decision has long been viewed as an act of true wisdom, an impartial judgment. But it's just a what-if scenario that we use to make an argument. I'm sure you've heard this argument in abortion, too. There's also some important adoption takeaways in the New Testament. Take Joseph. It's honorable, right, that he stayed with his pregnant wife and raised a son that wasn't his. This is the best kind of dad you can be, apparently. And I'll give him that one. I've got a great dad myself. Sidebar. I don't know much about my biological father, but I do know his name is Jesus. It's funny because there are a lot of metaphors in the New Testament about being adopted into God's family. One verse that comes to mind is Ephesians 1:5, which reads, God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. The selling point is that it's a privilege to be adopted into the family of God. And that metaphor directly maps to modern adoption. Adoptees are supposed to be grateful for the changes in their circumstances, which, by the way, are usually socioeconomic. But enough about adoption in the Bible. Let's switch gears and review some American history. That's what we're here for, right? So this next time span begins around 1945 after World War II and spans until 1973-ish when Roe v. Wade was passed. The baby scoop era. An estimated 4 million babies were adopted during this time period, largely due to shame around sex, around giving birth outside of marriage, and illegitimacy. Yeah, you wouldn't believe the crippling shame of someone finding out, you're a bastard, Jon Snow. That's why it was a really big deal in the 30s and 40s when the stamp illegitimate was taken off of adoptee birth certificates. Yeah, when babies were born out of wedlock, their birth certificates would have a stamp that said illegitimate. So it's not as if adoption didn't exist or have problems before the baby scoop era. It absolutely did. But this is the time when adoption in the United States got its big beginning as an industry. I'm talking money, baby. Babies being sold, adoption agencies getting rich. Oh, yeah. But after 1973, when Roe v. Wade passed and abortion was legalized, some adoptive parents asked why there were no more babies to adopt. What they really meant was there was a shortage of white babies. You see, before Roe, white women who got pregnant out of wedlock would be shamed and sent away to have their babies in secret, and then forced to give them up for adoption. But after Roe, white women had different options, like abortion, and less social stigma around single parenthood. This is partly why transracial and transnational adoptions rose in popularity. And that opens a whole other can of worms about children not having access to their cultural heritages and racial identities. I would know. Interestingly, American Christians who weren't looking to adopt white babies were largely silent after Roe. Most Protestants were in the camp of, isn't that more of a Catholic thing? Even James Dobson, the evangelical founder of Focus on the Family, who later became radically against abortion, said that the Bible didn't say anything on abortion. And it doesn't. What really began the evangelical political tilt against abortion wasn't Roe. It was desegregation. Yes, we have to talk about racism. In the late 70s, a group of white evangelical Christians were strategizing on how to retain tax exemptions for whites-only segregated schools. And they needed their congregations as a political base. And so they needed an issue that wasn't segregation. And so the issue that landed, abortion. Abortion mobilized many evangelical voters during the Reagan era. Something about Reagan, he was an adoptive parent himself. I think you should know that. And he was the first president to suggest adoption as an alternative to abortion. He declared the first National Adoption Week. I don't celebrate that. And the propaganda from the Reagan era is where my 90s adoption sprung from. So that brings us to some pretty recent history. Dobbs v. Jackson. In 2022, as I'm sure you remember, abortion was handed back to the states, 1 year shy of the 50-year anniversary. Before Roe fell, Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, another adoptive parent, said in reference to abortion that safe havens take care of that problem. To her, the problem is what to do with the results of an unwanted pregnancy. But to an adoptee like me, abandonment, especially with no records requirement, is the worst option. And then Justice Samuel Alito put adoption into terms of supply and demand. He wrote that adoptees are a domestic supply and lamented that that supply is virtually non-existent. His language blatantly commodified infants as objects for sale. But I am no object. I am not a product to be sold, though I do know the price I was sold for. I also know that the capitalist system we've built America on needs a steady supply of labor, which is threatened by access to abortion. Remember how Pharaoh wanted to cull the Hebrew population because he feared they'd rise up? This is the opposite. Capitalism needs a steady, if not growing, population to maintain its economy. And adoptees are the perfect vulnerable population to bring into existence for that purpose. Well, until we start misbehaving. We have to ask ourselves why we have these misconceptions about adoption and abortion and why we talk about them this way. We're making these arguments as if we're King Solomon, as if adoption and abortion are the same as a life and death choice. But it's never that simple. The choice a woman must make in response to an unwanted pregnancy must answer more questions than if her child will live. There are intersections here of economic hardship, of racial disparities, and imported biblical moral codes baked into our laws that make the decision of whether to give a baby up for adoption, abort the pregnancy, or become a parent so much more difficult. So what is this conversation really about? It's about wealth. It's about white privilege and control. It's about the government making choices for you by narrowing the options available. Adoption and abortion are complicated. You want to know if I would have preferred to have been aborted. And that's not a question I can answer without laying my entire life in front of you. And even then, I am just one life against the backdrop of so many lives who have endured harm in the name of adoption. Let's not simplify these stories into political and religious sound bites. Help me listen to the spectrum of experiences that are out there. Let's commit to listening, and we'll make some new histories. Thank you.